Mai ngā wai rarapa o te karu o te ka māui, ka rere, ka pari, ko rua mahanga, te awa, ko wairarapa, te moana. Ko ngā pai maunga o tararua, ko tōku maru, ko pāpā wai, te marae. Ko te whiti, ko tōku papakainga, ko tōku whenua, ko tōku tūranga waiwai. Ko ku tapu ai ki rangi whakao mauma, ki raro i te maru o rangi nui, ki runga i te ukai pō o papa tuānuku, ko rangi tāne ko ngā tika hungunu ki Wairarapa, ngā iwi. He uri anō tēnei o Ngāti Porou, o Ngāti Ira, arā ko horouta ko nuku tere ngā waka. He uri hoki tēnei o te arawa waka, o Ngāti Tūwharetoa, Ngāti Tahu, Ngāti Whāwa, Tū Hourangi, Ngāti Te Roro o te rangi. Ko reiri, ko rūtene, ko te kōwhai, ko te Hurihanganui, ngā ingoa whānau. No ingarangi hoki o Kutupuna, ko Sussex, ko Cornwall, ngā papakainga i Europi, ko Worsfold, te ingoa whānau. I whanau mai au ki whakaoriori o Wairarapa, e noho tonu anau ki whakaoriori me tōku whānau. Arā ko taku hua tāne a Davide Castorina, mea māua tamariki tokorua a Mario Kapua raua ko Marei Kura ana. He kāinga no tō mātou ki tā wāhi, ki te whenua o taku hoa ki Itari, arā ko Cireale Catania te ingoa, ko Etna te maunga, ko Achi te awa, ko Mediterraneo te moana, ko Hihiria te hapū, ko Ngai Itaria te iwi. Ko Reo Rua Limited te ingoa o taku Pākihi mahi, ko au he kaiako, he kai whakaako, Reo Māori, Reo Paniora, Reo Italiano, Reo Ingarihi hoki, tēnā no koutou katoa, Mauriora. And my name is Te Ataahia Eraina Hurihanganui, also known as Ataahia, my nickname. I was contracted by Fab Feathy, Reap Wairarapa, to co-create the Pae Tū Mōkai Featherston Bicultural Bilingual Strategic Action Plan in consultation with them, with schools, families, businesses, community groups, and wider Wairarapa marae and whānau as deemed necessary a few years ago. The project, of course, has had to stall, has had a few interruptions and disruptions and many challenges along the way, mainly due to COVID and the COVID climate and the impact that that has had on our very close and tight-knit community. This here is a presentation to introduce myself to you, the wider working group, as well as our funders, a little bit about me and what I do, how I do it, but more importantly, part of the summary to stage 1 of this very important project and initiative. So listen on in. Kia ora. As a brief reminder, stage 1 was a scoping and research task. It was for me to engage with Pae Tū Mōkai Featherston community and really understand who was or is already or recently supporting Te Reo Māori in our community, in the wider Wairarapa community, or in everyday life, either at home, in the schools or businesses, or beyond. I was tasked to engage in different events, different hui and wānanga over the years, and to collect and collate information pertaining to what we call, in my world of language acquisition and learning, language champions, people who were either using te reo or valuing it highly enough for it to grasp on to others who might be learning in the future. That collation record was to be put either into a database or presented in some form, and I've decided to do that in a video for you today. This slide speaks for itself and gives you a number of examples of some of the engagements I have had throughout the years. And when I say years, we have to remember that initially the contract was for 1 month, stage 1, but of course because of the delays with COVID and the inaccessible means to communicate and to get together. This has been a very long, drawn-out process, which was really important to the project itself. Some of the work that I have done has been based around meeting people, key people in the community of Pae Tū Mōkai, including some of our tutors and teachers of Te Reo Māori, running programs through the various entities. Some of it was certainly being a kanohi kitea, of providing my own presence at some of the local events that pertain to Te Ao Māori or Te Reo Māori. And you can see some of the different groups that I've also been working with that have been based in and around South Wairarapa, Pae Tū Mōkai. The one significant event I do want to highlight and focus on for this presentation in particular was Kura Whakarawara. Kura Whakarawara, like its sister school Kura Reo, has a strong focus in whānau Māori, people who are not Māori but are champions of Te Reo Māori, coming together, practicing and learning and developing in Te Reo together. The key difference is Kura Whakarawara is not a school or wānanga for learning Te Reo, but instead learning about how to strategize and create a language plan to create more reo immersive spaces and times in the different parts of our communities. And I quote, "An initiative to promote language planning as a key step to revitalize and regenerate Te Reo Māori within whānau, hapu, iwi and hapori. It will help you to understand the key requirements of language planning and to develop your own language plans." And I had the privilege to attend the more recent Wellington-based wānanga of Kura Whakarawara with my whānau. The learnings and teachings that I gained from there have been immense, have been important and significant enough for me to be here today to share them with you as a stepping stone for the next stage of this wider contract and project. I truly believe that because of its evidence base and the language experts who have gathered together to create Kura Whakarawara and its philosophies, that it will be a key part of moving this particular initiative forward for Pae Tū Mōkai. When you do get a chance, please read thoroughly through the resources, references and materials I have included in this last slide of this presentation. We do need to remember how important it is that Kura Whakarawara's philosophies and strategy itself is evidence-based, and you'll find a lot of that evidence through the links that I've provided. After the learnings of the wānanga at Kura Whakarawara, I have identified the key needs that we need in the Pae Tū Mōkai initiative to go forward and to further develop, remembering that we're working with a language that has almost died and very recently was closer to death than ever, a language that is still being revived and revitalized. This means that we need mother tongue speakers. And if that's not in a space like a kohanga reo or a kura kaupapa Māori, an institution that is based in the community, then it has to be a focus on those few families and whānau who speak Te Reo Māori in the home. An upbringing formed or surrounded by immersive Reo Māori. That means our tamariki mokopuna who are being raised, acquiring Te Reo as a first language, as opposed to having to learn it as a second language later on in life. We need intergenerational transfer. Tuku ihotanga and whakarawara reo, the revitalization of reo means not only do we see and hear more reo every day, but more and more people are using te reo. And that works best not only in the here and now of the present, but when it is being transferred from us to the next generation coming through and the next generation after that. We need, therefore, language domains. Living language means it's being used and transferred constantly by all of us, Māori and non-Māori. A language domain we will describe and define and look into a little bit later on in this presentation, but it's a space that is specifically and especially exclusively Te Reo Māori only. And it might be a really short amount of time, it might be a very small space in the community, whatever it is fully immersive. And we also need resource. And we always know this, but the resource can be really plentiful and really detailed, as you can see in some of the examples there. Or it can be as simple as having a language plan. And we're going to, again, develop some of these thoughts as we go through the slides today. Ka muri, ka mua. We cannot move forward, however, if we don't first reflect and observe where we have come from, where we have been. The next two slides give you some milestone key points in time of the Māori language journey since Pākehā and Tawiwi started to live and share our land here in Aotearoa with us, mana whenua Māori. Now, what I want to do first is vocalize and verbalize the predating history of what you're about to read with a quote. Rangitane people have lived continuously in the Wairarapa region for 28 generations, or some 700 to 800 years. Beginning with founding ancestors Kupe and Whātonga, they and their descendants have built up a rich history that is found in oral accounts, written records, and of course in the names across the landscape. Within these pages are origin stories of Rangitane o Wairarapa. There's also information on where and how early Rangitane people lived. This book is one in a series of 4 written about the histories and whakapapa of Rangitane people who have lived in the Wairarapa. The series includes Origins, Tupuna, Ngāti Hāmua, and Te Tapere Nui o Whātonga. These publications have been produced by Rangitane o Wairarapa with the help of Te Puni Kōkiri, and you can find these in the link at the end of this presentation in my list of resources, references and materials. There are acknowledgements to the author, Joseph Pōtangaroa, one of our rangatira Rangitane, as well as the advisors Koro Jim Rimene, Mike Kawana, Horipo Rimene, Jason Kerehi, Tipene Crisp, and Manahi Paiwai. Now, I have quoted this because we must be very mindful of Pae Tū Mōkai's positioning and its connection and historic reference to Kupe and its own name, its namesake. Now, when we think about that namesake, we must think about the further or wider community beyond Pae Tū Mōkai's more western map and border, and therefore include places like Lake Wairarapa and Cape Palliser. Now, if we're thinking that way, we must acknowledge mana whenua first and foremost, and we need to be really mindful that they too should be leading any reo initiative in their own area, and there are mana whenua entities set up, both Rangitane and Ngāti Kahungunu ki Wairarapa, as well as the various marae and hapu groups. Now, with that in mind, Lake Wairarapa is our ukai pō, is our sustenance, our provider, and therefore Pae Tū Mōkai is Wairarapa and is not south of Wairarapa, or cannot be south of itself. Just a little word of warning with how I will proceed with calling Pae Tū Mōkai Wairarapa and not South Wairarapa, and why also it's important to think about our map as a wider map than the more Western traditional maps that we've seen of the borders of Featherston, for example. Now, looking at what's in front of us, I want to predate 1816. By 1807, the first attempt at Te Reo orthography. 1806, 1807 saw a very famous English surgeon by the name of John Savage travel around New Zealand, meeting and greeting with Māori communities, learning Te Reo, and as he penned what he had heard, he started to develop what was the very first written account of the sounds of the Māori language, which of course until that point was oral. Thomas Kendall then came along, picked up a lot of those notes and developed them further. They were then developed even further with the guide of academic and literate Samuel Marsden, taken over to England to the King by a few tohunga Māori and Thomas himself, and settled. So the orthography has remained the same since then. So it's a fairly recent development of an orthography, and it's the one that we use, which is why the letters are the same as you would find in English. Thomas Kendall then went on to build the first missionary school, which was of course established in 1816, and while it was Te Reo in instruction, so the kaiako were speaking in Te Reo predominantly, the curriculum was English, and this was the very first of the institutionalized reo that we still see today. We fast forward a few years. 1842, of course, was Te Reo New Tireni, the first New Zealand newspaper, again only in Te Reo, completely printed and distributed all around the motu. As we know, we had Te Tiriti o Waitangi, and then the first few breaches by the Crown of that treaty, and therefore the New Zealand Wars. Now, to clarify, in 1847 Education Ordinance Act, the law meant only English as a language of instruction or teaching in schools was allowed. No more Te Reo Māori. That was a policy, a law. And then we saw in 1867, only 20 years later, the Native Schools Act. Now, there are many, many parts to that, but what is really important to note is that law meant that no te reo at all could be spoken by anyone in and around New Zealand schools from that point on. We fast forward a few more years, and the total Māori population declines to its lowest yet and its lowest ever, 42,113 Māori. 1920 to 1960 saw a significant decrease of males in general, but of course of Māori males because of the world wars, and then the further suffering from those wars, including the depression and the enormous urbanization of many Māori from their ukaipo, their tūranga waiwai, into the cities to find work, and therefore away from their sacred homelands where the only Reo Māori was still thriving. Now you can only imagine how incredibly significant and traumatic that time would have been for Te Reo Māori and its near death. Now we fast forward significantly to the 1970s because we don't see a huge amount of action until then. And the development of ngā tamatoa in the Te Reo Māori Society from both Auckland and Victoria universities was huge. A group of young Māori activists and advocates wanting to see Te Reo Māori valued by government, the Crown, and by New Zealanders in general. They marched, they created the petition, and because of that, we had our very first successful Te Reo Māori revitalisation project and initiative in Aotearoa in that same year. This, of course, was the crux and the motivation behind the first Māori Language Day, which became Māori Language Week, Te Wiki o Te Reo Māori, and other successful Māori language initiatives such as Te Whakatupuranga Rua Mano in Ōtaki, Te Whanganui Atara. In 1978, we had the development and creation and building of Ruatoki, the very first bilingual school since those early 1800s, and then of course the 1980s saw the beginning of what we still see and hear and celebrate today. Kohanga Reo, the very first in 82, Wainui o Mata. Kura Kaupapa Māori, the very first in 85, Hoani Waititi in Auckland, and then in 1987, law meant that Te Reo Māori was officially recognised as the official language of New Zealand, both socially and in the legal system, and ironically, the only one. English has never actually been officialised. It may have since then, but it certainly wasn't at the time, and we also have sign language officialised today. Now, the late 1980s also saw the development of Te Taurawhiri Te Reo Māori. With that act, a governing group an office which could officialise legal translations of things into Te Reo, for example, a group of people and experts who would create new reo for things that didn't already have original Māori language for, and then of course start different funding schemes, opportunities, initiatives and projects for the wider Aotearoa community. This of course spurred media to get on board, so we saw Te Upokotika radio station start to form. That followed with Te Māngai Pāho, our Māori funding scheme, and in 2004 Māori TV and the Te Reo channel later in 2008. A very important thing to note was the 2016 Māori Language Act update, which was reenacted by government and is called Te Maihi Karauna. This maihi is what a lot of kura whakarawara's hopes and dreams are invested in, and it's the idea that in a few years' time we will see a significant increase in Te Reo speakers all across New Zealand, and then eventually between 2040 and 2050 a huge amount of our population will be speakers. So with that in mind, we have full support from our government and from those in power to get our Pae Tū Mōkai plan off the ground. So how can Te Reo Māori enhance the environment? How can you or your environment help increase the ability and confidence of New Zealanders in general to speak or choose to speak Te Reo Māori? What can you do to increase the number of Māori that use Te Reo at least as much as English? This part of the presentation is to move from the past into the here and now. We've got the context and the background that we need, hopefully a little bit of inspiration from some of those initiatives mentioned, particularly in the last few decades, so that we can feel empowered enough to move forward. But we can't do that without discussing these questions first as individuals, then as groups within our home and whānau, and then as groups beyond in our businesses, in our schools, and in our community groups. Once we've started that conversation, we can start to apply the philosophies and the strategy of the Kura Whakaroara language plan, which I will start to present in summary and highlights from the next slide onwards. Nō reira tātou mā, nau mai ki tēnei te mahere reo Māori. This here is our language plan or strategy based on the Kura Whakaroara learnings from my time there at Wānanga. Now there are many strategies and plans in the world that can get quite complex. This one is very simple to understand and it comes in 5 different parts. Now I'm going to introduce to you the 5 different parts, their names and definitions and translations, and then we're going to break them down slowly. And again, please bear in mind, because this is not my material, I'm simply a sharer or a person who is transferring this knowledge. We will only be highlighting and capturing the summaries of each of these, but it will give you an idea of what we need to do as individuals, as people in homes, as people in communities, schools and businesses to further develop a really robust structure and system for the revitalisation of reo and Pae Tū Mōkai. Now, bearing in mind what we may be thinking about as a working group is, do we invest in getting this out to the language champions and allowing them to create their own plans, or is it our responsibility to create the plan for them? That is one question I want to start with, but let's get into it. Te rima teite. The high five is one analogy we can think about because it requires all 5 of our fingers to complete. So in other words, you need each of the 5 parts for your language plan to be successful. The first is mana, value. The value that we put on Te Reo Māori, hearing and seeing it around us. The second is tinana, corpus. What is the body of our kōrero? What type of language are we actually talking about in our plan? The third is ako, acquisition. How exactly are we going to be learning and acquiring reo in our plan? The fourth is maramapu or maramapu, and this is about the critical analysis that is involved in a plan, the reflection, the observation, the evaluation of whether or not it's doing well and what we can do to improve it or move it. And the last but not least, whakamahi, doing, actioning, speaking te reo. We're going to have a look at each of these individually, and hopefully you can apply this either to yourself as part of this working group or beyond to our language champions who will hopefully be taking some of the learnings from here and creating this in their own space and place. Mana status or value is all about how will Māori language be valued by all. Is it and will it be inspiring? Is it actually connecting with the people needing to use it or value it? And is it about unifying and togetherness and not feeling or being exclusive? Secondly, how can Te Reo Māori become part of the commitment? Now, this is about the identity of Te Reo for those people who don't have a connection to Te Ao Māori or don't have whakapapa Māori. How can it be part of their integrity and their identity as a New Zealander? Now, if we're thinking about Pae Tū Mōkai and the significant area that it is, I've just taken some examples from other spaces and regions of how this could be applied. Mana is seen when colleagues and business people and workers are using te reo in their everyday communications, even if it is online and emails, for example. Valuing Te Reo Māori is being able to see it visually wherever you are. So we have signage on streets and on the roads and around the community physically. We also have signage inside buildings and offices showing the beauty of Te Reo. On a smaller scale, in the home, we might see Māori language being celebrated through art, through toi Māori, through the use of Māori in everyday routines and rituals, like placing proverbs on the family fridge, or beautifying our spaces on walls with Māori language and Māori things. To summarise, the first part of the language plan is how are you going to make it connect, engaging and beautiful for everyone who needs to interact with that space, place or time. The second part is about corpus or tinana. How will the reo be relevant? In our plan, we need to really specify and define what is the reo that we're talking about. Is it everyday speech for everyone? Is it just greetings and proverbs? Is it formal te reo or is it informal? Are we wanting the reo that we revitalise in our plan to be dialect or particular type of reo, or is it going to be standardised reo so that anyone and everyone can use it? What is its relevance to the context? And more than that, what are the specific reo components that we might need to consider using within it? For example, as a teacher of te reo, I'm really mindful that when I am teaching Māori words in a vocabulary list, for example, that I need to be mindful of the grammar aspects and the functions of certain words in longer words or concepts of Te Ao Māori, and therefore I'm really considerate of things like parts of speech, the whakapapa of te reo, and some examples are there on the right. Some businesses might use Māori concepts like manaakitanga, rangatiratanga and whakapapa as values and principles in their business strategies, in their business plans. But how is that then seen and pushed through our first part of the plan, mana, seen and heard around their environment? So what I need you to start to think about now is that each of these parts are individual parts, but they do need to work together or have some relevance to each other for the overall strategy to work. In other words, to be able to high five. Some examples around the corpus is going into the next third part of our strategy, which is ako, acquisition. Where might we find what we need to be able to develop this part of our plan? Is it providing ourselves or accessing resources like whakatauki and proverb books, how are we then going to interact with each other using this reo, especially in a post-COVID world, where and when much of what we're doing in terms of engagement, interaction, and communicating is online? Is it looking at apps and other online suites and softwares to be better allow access for people to engage in that specific reo? So to elaborate, ako is exactly as it says, to teach and to learn. How will proficiency be enhanced? What we don't want in a plan is to succeed right away and to not move or grow. A good plan is one that we can reflect on, successfully implement, successfully achieve, and then grow and challenge ourselves by making it bigger, bolder, or extending. And therefore, we need to understand where we need to develop as individuals. So if this is for us as a working group and we're creating the plan for the language champions in Pae Tū Mōkai, for example, what are we doing to make sure that we remain the experts? If we are instead empowering the language champions to do this for themselves, how do we need to keep ourselves safe so that we can best support them? And what resource do we need to provide them so that they're keeping themselves safe as they build on their own knowledge and don't stay static? And therefore, we're looking at things like lessons and courses and the investment that that might involve. In-house support, that's us. How are we going to do that? Is it a mentorship? Is it weekly hui? Is it quarterly meetings? What types of resources and materials do we need to develop? Or do we need to help our language champions develop? The fourth part of our language strategy is marama pū, or critical awareness and analysis. This is all about the reflection and observations and evaluations. How will the language domains be managed? And I'm going to talk about those language domains very soon. But how do we reflect and how often? How might we evaluate either ourselves, each other, or the wider community, and how the strategy being applied to an entire town is working or not, and the leadership that we might need from the top, and that includes you, our funders. Do we need to continue to be dependent upon you? How often do you need us to report back to you, etc.? How will inclusive learning domains be managed? You know, if we've got lots of pockets of language domains all around Pae Tū Mōkai, some people are doing this in the home, some community groups are leading things in communities, only a handful of businesses are leading the charge to get this more visually stimulating. Te Reo Māori flying around the place, etc. How might we manage those different entities all at once? Or is it not about managing them at all? Instead, is it sitting back and watching it thrive and flourish alone? These are the types of things we need to consider in this fourth and important part of our strategy. And before I bring you number 5, the most important part really, I do want to use another analogy to our 5-part system. And it's not the high 5, but instead it's the 5 elements of an oven or stovetop. What you might discover when you start really recognizing, getting to know this strategy is, like I said earlier, all 5 parts need to work together, but they're not all working the same. Sometimes the parts might be turned off, much like the hob on the oven. Sometimes they'll be up and down, up and down. Sometimes they'll be at low, go up to medium, go up to high, and then come back down to low again. Sometimes they're on high the whole time. So depending on your decision of your language domain, these are going to fluctuate. They're never static. Neither is language nor communication, nor the revitalization of Reo. It's never ever static. But one thing we do need to remind ourselves is with every hob, we all have that special hob, that one hob that we know works best, that one hob that we could not live without. And that for us in this particular initiative is whakamahi, use. None of the hobs or the strategy will work if there is no use. And we've heard many examples earlier on in this presentation of why that is, i.e. we need mother tongue speakers, language needs to be acquired, language needs to be transferred, and none of that can happen if it's not being used. So this is the one hob that is always on. It's never off, and it may be down low simmering sometimes, but it needs to have some moments of medium and high. So let's look at that. If we are creating this plan or strategy, we need people to sign it, and people are signing to do it. Yeah, like any other contract, you sign so that it gets actioned. All people who know about the plan, whether they authored it or they're the language champions, they need to be involved. And we want to create a beautiful immersion domain, an inclusive learning environment which is sensory, safe and engaging. Without those things, people are simply not going to want to be part of it. Consistency and repetition are key. We only remember 50% of what we see and hear, so signage is simply not enough, and nor is listening to Māori radio. We remember 70% of what we say, so speaking greetings is a wonderful way to retain new reo, but we do remember 90% of what we say and do. So if the greeting is one thing, imagine being able to play a game, like a game of cards with your children, and knowing that you're giving yourself a 90% chance of not only knowing that Māori language used in that space and time of that game, but that you're most likely going to retain it for a very long time afterwards. So we're going to look at some examples in the next slide about how this might be implemented using a home example, a business example, and a community-based example. Number one, the home-based example. Now, a language domain is a choice between a time, a place, or a context. One really popular decision for a place in a home context is the kitchen bench for breakfast time. Now, many families know that breakfast time isn't the time that we particularly or necessarily engage in conversation. That would typically be dinner. However, breakfast is usually a routine or habitual thing, and therefore there are some commonalities from one day to the next. Enough for it to be a really strong language domain, and for it to not drag on for too long. Now, a language domain is best when there is some yellow tape. Yellow tape is something that tells us that this particular time, place, or context is Te Reo Māori immersive. As an example for time, we might have a bell that we ring before breakfast starts, and that particular breakfast is going to be in Te Reo Māori until you hear the bell ring again at the end, and people can switch, if they want to, back into English. The yellow tape might be a particular placemat that you put out when it's Te Reo Māori for breakfast time. Yeah, and so there's an example of the place and time for that breakfast. It's very visually clear. Ko Te Reo Māori noi ho e rere ana, mai ahau kia koutou. Yeah, tātou kia tātou. So, what do we do in the language domain? Well, we only speak Te Reo Māori, and we only speak Te Reo Māori as if we were speaking in English. So it might be labelling the different jars and cereal boxes in Te Reo Māori. It might be saying, oh, hey, mum, can you pass me that? Oh, hey, bro, can you pass me this? Oh, do you like this? Yes, it's delicious. Whatever the language is needed, we look back at our other 4 parts of the plan and we make sure that they're developed enough to support that language domain to thrive. And as soon as the yellow tape comes down, whether it's the bell or the placemats get put away, people can switch out of it. There's an example of a language domain in the home. A language domain in the business can be really big or really small. Many businesses are already doing this in the form of karakia time. Karakia is a time in which people gather to speak aloud a karakia in Māori in the morning typically, or before a significant event. Now that karakia is in te reo, so that is a context, but it's also a time, because typically karakia is at every Wednesday at 9 a.m, for example. And it might be only 5 minutes at the beginning, but what we could start to do in the language plan, again looking at that critical analysis, looking at mana and all the different parts of it, is extend it. So every month the 5 minutes might become 5 minutes more, 10 minutes, 5 minutes more, 15 minutes, 5 minutes more, 20 minutes, until the karakia is not just a karakia anymore. Maybe we've added on a waiata Māori. Maybe we've added on greetings around the circle in Te Reo Māori after karakia and waiata have completed. Maybe we've added on a whakatauki or proverb of the week. And then by the end of a few months' time, we've spent 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 minutes in a full immersive reo environment. The yellow tape is often fun for a business, and it might be something simple like a basket of natural shells and sticks from our natural world that get picked up by the person who speaks in Te Reo Māori and put down when they're no longer speaking in Te Reo Māori. Picked up when they are saying the karakia and put back into the basket when the karakia is finished, and so on. Now, the third and final example I'm going to give you is a community or space or group out and about. Now, one thing that I have seen in Pae Tū Mōkai specifically is the Kia ora dairy. Now, that is a particular place, but because it's the Kia ora dairy, your language strategy around that might be really specific to that name. And so whenever anyone or everyone walks in or out of that space, the greetings always and only in Te Reo Māori. Really easy because you've already got the yellow tape. But the biggest challenge is how do you develop from there? So to finish and to complete this presentation, another series of wānanga. Are we ready? Is Pae Tū Mōkai actually ready? Based on all of the information that I've shared from my learnings and from my scoping and research, do you think that we have enough? What can we already see and hear? How much support is there? And what more can we do? So again, I prompt us, the working group, to really think about whether it is us that should be leading this, whether it's mana whenua, or whether it is the language champions themselves. And if it's either of the second or the third, how are we placed in that? What is our responsibility really? In conclusion, I remind us all of the language champions that I have discovered through my scoping and research in Pae Tū Mōkai right now. Businesses, Kia ora dairy, community groups, Whawhiri, Pae Tū Mōkai o Tauira. Education, health and social services, which include Reap Wairarapa Te Reo courses, and especially the Te Ataahia courses being run through the marae and being led by our rangatira Edith Rose. Marae and spaces, we are surrounded by pāpāwai, by kohunui and by hauariki. And while we don't have a marae specifically in Featherston, Pae Tū Mōkai's borders should be beyond the traditional Western map that we have become accustomed to in recent time. And last but certainly not least, the most important of all, our language champion babies, tamariki moko puna. Our puna, our ECE schools, te kura o Pae Tū Mōkai are great leaders in this space. Te taonga te reo. Language is the roadmap of a culture. It tells you where its people come from and where they are going. For more information or to get in touch with me, please visit my website www.reorua.co.nz. Email me on Ataahia, that's TAAHIA @reorua.com, or connect with me via LinkedIn using my full name, Te Ataahia Hurihanganui.